Hi, this is Steve Flores and this is Unit 6, Use Communication to Build Relationships. And you can see here the parts of the unit. It's a very big unit. And if you think about your role in the boarding residence and the skills that you bring to the job, you'll realise that communication is probably the most important of all of those skills. It's the most critical skill that we can bring to this job. There's two assessments, 6.1 which are knowledge-based written assessments and 6.2 which is a project with 3 parts to it. When we think about communication, we're thinking about the exchange of meaning between one individual and another, the meaning that goes from my head across into your head, and it can be a spoken, written, digital message. Sometimes it's not even spoken at all. It might be just a person putting their hand on their, your shoulder at a funeral or something like that, and they convey sympathy or something else. We use lots of different means or methods for communicating, phone calls, emails, texts, phone apps, duty books or journals, whiteboards, letters, newsletters, meetings, and face-to-face, of course. And we use all of these in our boarding residence, and this is the basis of question 1. And if we think about if a student's involved in an incident at school, how does the head of boarding find out? If there's a new duty roster with changes, well then how does the supervisor find out? If a student's unwell and upset during one roster shift, then how does the next roster find out? If there's a new calendar of recreation events, how do the students get to find out? If the supervisor has to leave the residence unexpectedly, how does the head of boarding and other staff, how are they informed about this? If a student's injured in an accident on an excursion, how does the head of boarding and parents find out? So you'll have your strategies and ways to communicate, and it's important to work out what really works in your situation and to be using those strategies effectively. Sometimes we'll need to address specific issues. We need to do this as quickly as possible and to communicate that the issue is being dealt with, not to leave unresolved issues because they grow into much larger issues. Sometimes you might have to refer the matter on to other people to use a mediator or a mediation process such as restorative justice. When we look at verbal communication, there's the 3 parts: what we say, the verbal message, how we say it, paraverbal message, and body language, which is a non-verbal message. So let's just have a look at what we say, what makes a successful verbal message. And it's these things here: brief and to the point, free of jargon, using the language of your listener, not critical, blaming, judgmental or accusing, empathy for the listener, not making the person lose face, and using general statements for criticism. So let's unpack a few of those. It's important when we're communicating to be brief and to the point, not to waffle on and take a long while to get to what you're wanting to say. To be free of jargon, and Australians use jargon probably more than any other people, and if you're overseas talking to people overseas, you'll often see a blank face and you realise that you've used a piece of Australian jargon. Using the language of your listener means, if you are talking to a child, you would use different language than, say, talking to your university professor. So just suiting the language to the person who's listening. This is in red, this one, because I think this is very important. Not critical, blaming, judgmental or accusing, because remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make a successful verbal message. That means that we want the person to have the same meaning that we have. And if we're critical of them, if we're blaming or judgmental or accusing, they don't hear our message. Instead, they hear that, that we might be a nasty person or that we're a fool or an idiot or something like that. That's the message they hear. So we just need to be very careful around being critical, blaming, judgmental or accusing. Having empathy for the listener is very important, to walk in their shoes, and not making the person lose face. And this is very important with young people. And using general statements for criticism, not coming into a situation and saying you did this, you did that, but making a more general statement rather than focusing on a person. So that's what we say and what makes a successful verbal message. Then, of course, it's very important how we say it, because we can change the emphasis, the loudness, the tone, and the speed of our words. And by changing those, being very careful about those, we can actually completely change the way we communicate. In 1963, Professor Mehrabian said that 7% of the meaning is in the words that are spoken, 38% of the meaning is in the way that the words are said, that's the emphasis, loudness, tone and speed, and 55% is in facial expression. Now I think today, if we think about it today, it's probably not quite like that. It's probably, a lot more of the meaning is in the words that are spoken. We text, for instance, and unless you're using some way of putting emphasis into texts, capitals or some other way, then it is just text. They can't see your facial expressions. They can't see the way in which you're texting. So the way we speak is important. Very often we can't control it, or it's very hard to control. When we're angry or excited, our words are rapid and our voice is high-pitched. When we're defensive, our words can be curt and abrupt. When we're bored and depressed, our words can be very slow and monotone. So the third part of this is body language. And our bodies can give a message even though we might be saying something quite different with our words. And this is facial expressions, hand signs, eye and head movement, crossing your arms, all those sort of things. Body language is very important, and people can see straight away what you're actually saying, even if you're saying something different with your words. So how can you use this information to communicate more effectively? This little part we've done already. Firstly, just remember those 8 dot points for sending a successful message, for giving a successful message, conveying meaning, because those 8 dot points are critical. Practice good communication all the time. Don't be lazy about communication. Just be aware of how you say it and the body language. And before you speak, reflect on the message you want to send, how you'll say it, and your body language. Anticipate what sort of response you might get back. So be thoughtful and intentional about how we communicate. Another part of communication, of course, is listening. And real listening is a very complex art. To be an effective listener, we must do these things. Hear the words, hear the way the words are delivered, read the body language, have empathy, and try and delay judgment, try and understand first. And what we mean by that is that if a student comes to you and says, I want to go down the shop, or I want to do this or whatever, listen to them, hear them out, rather than cutting them off and judging them at the start of their conversation or the start of the, what they're going to say to you. So delay judgment and try and understand first. And this is all about effective listening. Listening with empathy is so important, just trying to understand the message, respecting and accepting the person, walking in their shoes, genuinely trying to see it through their eyes, and just delaying judgment and approval, really, as we have said already. Reflective listening is an effective strategy, and this is simply trying to understand the speaker's idea and repeating it back to them. And this has 3 benefits. One is that it increases the listener's understanding, it helps the speaker to clarify their thoughts, and it shows the speaker that you're really listening because you've just said back to them what they've said to you. So you have to be listening to do it. So reflective listening can be a very good tool. We have some general communication barriers, and that's these barriers here: physical, perceptual, emotional, cultural, language, and gender, and interpersonal barriers. Physical barriers in a boarding environment might be areas where other people are not allowed, closed office doors, separate areas for people with roles, different roles, that sort of thing. And just this little part here, research shows that one of the most important factors in building cohesive teams is proximity, how close you are to each other. It's very hard to build an effective team if people are shut away from each other. Then we have perceptual barriers. We all see the world a little differently. We have different perceptions on situations because of our, previous experience. All of our experiences are different. Emotional barriers, there might be things like fear, mistrust, suspicion, might be from your childhood. You might feel vulnerable, hold back from communicating, but these are emotional barriers. Cultural barriers, if you're culturally different, and they say it does take a long time to break into another culture, to be accepted in another culture. Language barriers, and we've talked already about using buzzwords and jargon, but if you are a person for whom English is a second or sometimes even a third language, this can be a barrier to effective communication. And gender barriers. Sometimes a person's gender might cause a communication barrier, and this is going to be evident more evident in some cultures. Interpersonal barriers. So people can be distanced from each other for a range of different social and cultural reasons. We can look at two types of communication barrier. We've got meaning barriers, and that's where we've got different meanings for the words spoken, and that can be, again, different perceptions, but it also can just be that you're speaking a different language. But I want to talk to you particularly about message barriers, because this is important, and we can really change the way we communicate if we're careful about message barriers. A message barrier is something in the message that raises resistance in the receiver. So, and it's generally something in the way the message is delivered. So if you attack somebody, interrogate, criticize, blame, or shame them, then there will be a barrier to you conveying your message to them. If you use you messages like moralizing, preaching, advising, diagnosing, then there will be a barrier in you conveying meaning to another person. Showing power is another barrier. I'm the boss around here, you're not going to do that, that sort of thing. And other verbal barriers such as shouting, name calling, refusing to speak, and non-verbal barriers like body language. So we can change the way that we deliver the message. And if we deliver the message effectively, then we will be much more effective in our role in boarding. Non-verbal barriers can include all these sort of things, flashing or rolling eyes, quick or slow movements, arms and legs crossed, gestures made with exasperation, slouching, hunching over poor, personal care, doodling, staring at people or avoiding eye contact, excessive fiddling. All of those sort of things can be non-verbal barriers. So let's have a little look at hostile communication. I know you did some of this in Unit 4. Hostile communication, when somebody is hostile towards us, they're communicating in a hostile way. So for me, in my role as a principal, this might have been a parent ringing up and very angry, swearing at you, that sort of thing. These are the things that we must do. We must remain mirror calm and respond professionally. And we see this in people in callback centres. When they're dealing with complaints, they're trained to do this. Doesn't matter how angry you are, how upset, how accusing you are, they always remain calm and respond professionally. Well, the good ones do, because they're trained to do it. They know how to do it. They don't take it personally. Use humour to deflect attacks or rudeness. You have to be a little bit careful here in that the student needs to know that you're taking them seriously, but humour is a very good tool to, light humour to deflect attacks or rudeness. Rolling with the punches, deflecting and redirecting what they're saying, or using strip phrases. These are short phrases where you achieve agreement before you redirect. You might say, Susie, you're saying you're not happy about the room choice, is that right? And, so you're getting her to agree with this, because what we're saying agrees with what she's saying, and then we redirect. interrupt by paraphrasing, try and respond empathetically, and be a good listener. All of these are parts of dealing with hostile communication. When we engage with people who are uncooperative, hostile, aggressive, angry, often their idea is to get you stressed enough so that you'll lose your cool and respond unprofessionally. And why? Why do they do that? Well, they think that this unprofessional conduct that you then display justifies their unacceptable aggression or hostility. So we must be very careful just to remain calm and respond professionally. I know it's hard. It's hard to do it when we're being attacked, when our organisation's being attacked, our practice, is being attacked. But we must remain calm and respond professionally. Here's a little cartoon. I like this cartoon. Can you call back later? I'm just installing a new driver in my computer. I don't think he's responding calmly and professionally. Interview procedure. It's a big section in your notes, and I'm hoping that you'll read your notes and go through this material fairly carefully and probably use it in the future, come back to it in the future, because there is a lot of useful material in there. When we're looking at question types, there's some question types here: open questions, closed, leading, complex. And open questions are questions where there is no yes or no answer. So it might be something like, could you tell me a little bit about what you did on your weekend? Or where it's a very open question and you're expecting, more than just a single word answer, expecting an expansive sort of answer. Closed questions are where you would just be expecting a yes or a no, or, a very short answer. So did you get out of the dormitory last night, or did you go to the shop last night? You would want a yes or a no or something like that. Leading questions are where we put information in the actual question. And so it might be something like, when you got out of the window and over the fence, did you go straight up to the shop? And sometimes when we use questions like that, we may not know whether they got over the fence or whether they went a different way. But this is a way of finding out. So that's why we use leading questions. And, if they just answer and said, oh, well, I went straight up to the shop, they went over the fence. If they say over the fence, I didn't go over the fence, I went through the gate. So it's a way of getting information. Complex questions, there's two types of complex questions we want to look at. There's a double negative, where you might say you didn't not, or something like that, where you're using two negatives in the one question. Or a complex question might be a multiple question, where you're saying to a student, why did you get out of the dormitory last night? Why did you go to the roadhouse? Why did you buy that alcohol? You're asking them this series of questions without waiting for a response. The problem with complex questions, and why we should not use complex questions, is that the answers have no meaning. It's pointless even asking these questions because the answers have no meaning. When we're questioning, we always move from the general to the specific, or from open to closed questions. And you can see here there's a lot of interview procedure here, and you can go through this yourself. Here's a bit more here as well, and some of this is in question 11. I want to talk to you about motivational interviewing, and this is a little hard to understand, to wrap your head around, so I'm going to try and explain it to you. It's a fairly new type of interviewing. So it centres around trying to resolve ambivalence. So this ambivalence takes the form of conflict between two courses of action. It might be something like indulgence versus restraint, or something like that. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with the student to help them come to this place themselves where they resolve this ambivalence. And so, the ambivalence might be something like the fact that the student will not do their homework, won't put any effort into their homework, And so they're just ambivalent about their homework. They don't know whether they want to do it or whether they don't want to do it. They're ambivalent about it, and so, or there's another one here on this slide. If I stop smoking, I'll feel better about myself, but I may also put on weight, which will make me feel unhappy and unattractive. So the person is ambivalent. The counsellor, and in this situation, you are the counsellor, the counsellor's task is to facilitate expression of both sides of the ambivalence deadlock. So you're trying to get the student to express both sides of it and guide the student towards coming towards an acceptable resolution. With motivational interviewing, the motivation to change is elicited from the student and not imposed from without. So we're trying to get that from the student, trying to draw that out of the student. These photos are all from Penang. It is the student's task, not the interviewer's task. Remember, you're the interviewer or the counsellor. So it's the student's task to express or resolve their own ambivalence. Direct persuasion is not an effective method for resolving ambivalence. So it's very tempting to try and be helpful and persuade or offer, suggestions or ideas. These tactics generally increase the student's resistance and diminish the probability of change. The counselling style is generally a quiet and eliciting one. So direct persuasion, aggressive confrontation, argument are the opposite of motivational interviewing. They're unacceptable in this approach. So remember, the purpose is to help the student examine and resolve their own ambivalence. The assumption in motivational interviewing is that ambivalence or lack of resolve is the main obstacle to be overcome in triggering change. Once that's been accomplished, there may or may not be a need for further intervention, such as skill changing. So readiness to change is not a student trait, but it's a changing product of the interpersonal interaction. So the relationship is more like a partnership or companionship rather than expert-recipient roles. The interviewer or counsellor, that's you, respects the student's autonomy and freedom of choice and consequences regarding his or her own behaviour. So it's interesting to think of how could you actually use motivational interviewing. And I guess when we have thought about this, when we're preparing this material, it's something that's a part of this course and you have to know it as part of the training package, so that's why it's in here. So when we think about it, we don't think about motivational interviewing being the 5-minute interview you're going to have with a student, after homework one night. We think that these strategies are to resolve ambivalence, and the strategies and the way that you deal with this might be over months and months. So it's it's a very long-term strategy. And we also feel that this is a very useful strategy for resolving very difficult, deep-seated student issues and problems that may not be able to be resolved in any other way. And in the past, we may have suspended or expelled a student for a particular type of behaviour. Now we have another tool for trying to resolve, trying to bring, some meaning or some resolution of the ambivalence. So I hope that is a useful thing. You might just go back and read the notes to get a bit more information on it. Let's have a bit of a look at negotiation. When we look at negotiation, we've got these things here: preparation, discussion, clarifying goals, bargaining for a win-win outcome, agreement, implementing a course of action. So preparation for negotiation is very important, for a real negotiation. And it's important, I think, that you go back and read the notes in your book about this. So preparation is important. The discussion about the different parts of it, clarifying goals. And when I think about negotiation, I think that the most important part of it is listening to the other person, because that in negotiation we both want something. I want something and the other person wants something. You want something and the other person wants something. And that those two things will be different. And so you're trying to get what you want, they're trying to get what they want, and you need to somehow meet in the middle. And it's very important. The most important part of this is listening to the other person, but even more than that is for the other person to know that you're genuinely listening to them. And so that listening is very important. Bargaining for that win-win outcome, getting agreement, implementing a course of action. Sometimes we have bargained something out, negotiated something out, come to a resolution, and then found that we have to go back and revisit that. You might have to do that a couple of times before you've got something that everybody's completely happy with. So I know that in a boarding context, the rosters are something that where there's often a lot of negotiation. I'm just going to talk very briefly about strategies for culturally aware communication, because Unit 7 deals with this in a lot more detail. But these things here, just being aware, being very aware of different cultures, the way that different cultures operate, and the difficulties for communication between different cultures. Listen and ask questions. Speak carefully and speak slowly. When you talk to a person from another culture, they'll often say the most difficult thing for them is when people talk fast or talk quickly. Watch the nonverbal, and gain knowledge however you can. And you can gain knowledge from your translators, your language translators, the people in your organisation that might be part of that culture, from informal cultural interpreters, and there's lots of other ways too. The internet, of course, is a wonderful tool for getting information about cultures. Books, movies, TV reports, etc. And of course, once you've got that rapport, you can ask the individual themselves. Just get as much knowledge as you can. If we can just remember that if problems do develop, it's much, much better to be patient and forgiving rather than hostile and judgmental. So in these cross-cultural situations, just try and be patient and forgiving and accrue as much knowledge as you can. The next part of this is about representing the organisation, and one of your practical exercises is about this, and we'll talk more about that in the webinar. But we need to find out, what sort of information is required, making sure that our information is clear, concise, correct. How do I best convey it? And who needs to know? So the sort of thing that we're talking about where you'd be representing the organisation is if you might be going out to talk to a parent group somewhere, and to talk to the parent group about your organisation. When you do this, it's important to work out how are you going to attack this? What's going to be your strategy? Are you going to look at your organisation from the ethos, from the vision, the goals, or are you going to look at it from the facilities, or are you going to look at it from the history? How are you going to start? Where are you going to lead into? All of that sort of thing. So it's important to work through all of that when you're representing your organisation, to put it together very carefully. When you're doing this, it's really important not to hang out the dirty laundry. And the fact of the matter is that all boarding organisations, all boarding schools and residences, we all have things that go wrong. We all have problems, and it's not the business of anybody else. And so we shouldn't hang out our dirty laundry, and not to exaggerate. Don't say, if you send your student to us, we can do this and that. It's always better to under-promise and over-deliver. It's always best to be really well organised, be professional and well prepared. I want to talk to you just briefly about effective, and we're nearly at the end of this, but effective meetings. And we've all been in meetings which waste everybody's time. And, if you're in a meeting like that and you've got 10 people sitting there and somebody's just wasted half an hour of your time, you're talking about 5 man hours that's just been wasted, just trashed. And so if if you've got good preparation, good meeting technique, and a good agenda, it can avoid wasted time, frustration, conflict, and poor decisions. And so I want to talk to you talk about meetings around agenda design. So if you've got poor agenda design, people are unprepared, the conversation goes off track, and the whole event is a waste of time. An effective agenda sets clear expectations, it helps people prepare, allocates time wisely, gets everyone on the same topic, identifies when a discussion is complete, and effectively and quickly addresses problems or conflict. So if you're going to fully explore a topic, make sure it's in the agenda before a meeting. So don't just list it as an agenda item. So for example, you might be talking about, let's just say you're talking about the lockers, the student lockers, and what you actually want to find out is how are we going to allocate the student lockers? So what people do is they put on the agenda student lockers, and then you get everybody talking about their random stuff about the student lockers. We don't want to hear all that stuff. We just want the question answered. How will we allocate student lockers? So you list it as a question to answer. And then you give it enough time. And if you look around the table and you've got 5 people sitting there or 10 people sitting there, and you know that probably half of them at least are going to want to input, they might have 2 or 3 minutes to input each. And so you need to do the maths on this and make sure you've got enough time for each agenda item. Ask staff to prepare and bring their information, their ideas, and their solution. So specify how people should prepare for meetings. Identify who's going to lead a topic. Probably won't always be, that the head of boarding. Somebody, might have a special interest, so they might lead that topic. And you always make the first topic to review and modify the agenda. So you sit down. Well, these days a lot of people are having stand-up meetings. So they say stand-up meetings are about 35% more effective than sit-down meetings. You sit down or stand up or whatever, and then the first topic would be, let's have a look at this agenda. Is there anything that we should change before we get started in the meeting? And so you've got an agreement on the agenda before you start. So strategies for an effective event agenda are seeking input from the supervisors or from your house parents or whatever you call them. Select topics that affect the entire group. And, you and I have probably both been in meetings where, part of the meeting, a good part of the meeting, will just affect a small part of the group, and why are we even there? It's just wasting our time because they could have had a separate meeting. So just select topics that affect the entire group. We've talked about listing agenda items as questions that need to be answered, and note whether the purpose is to share information, seek input for a decision, or to actually make a decision. You need to work out how you're going to come to a decision. So for example, if you are going to make a decision on something, is that going to be a consensus? Are you only going to make a decision on it if everybody agrees to it? Or is it 3/4 of the people or 50%? How are you going to come to a decision? When you're facilitating meetings, it's important that you hear everyone. So that means setting ground rules early, acknowledging contributions, don't let people cut each other off. Manage dominant talkers, people who will dominate the discussion. Ask quiet people for their opinion or their input. And then, deal with communication needs. Ask if everybody's able to see the board. Is there enough light? Is the writing big enough? Can everybody hear? You might need to remind people to speak up. Is the layout okay? Are there any language barriers? What do we do about conflict? If there is conflict, stop the meeting briefly, remain calm, identify the cause and work towards a resolution, agree on a procedure for conflict resolution. One person speaks at a time, no accusations, that sort of thing. Give the group thinking time. Give the group opportunity to share, identify the basic facts, identify proposed solutions, and you know what? If there's still disagreement, an effective way to deal with it is to form a subgroup to go away and study the issue in more depth. So you might have, you might have an issue around the buses being dirty when they come back from excursion or something like that. And if people are angry and upset about it, form a little subgroup to deal with it, and then get on with your main meeting. It's a good way to resolve that sort of conflict. If you're recording, decide who's going to minute the meetings, nominate or somebody, prepare and get set up early. And this is where a good agenda layout is important, and we will make sure we've got a good agenda layout as an attachment for you. All important decisions, motions, tasks are recorded and actioned with a time frame. And the good thing about a good agenda layout is that you should be recording as you go through the meeting, and people can virtually take that away or have it emailed to them virtually as soon as the meeting is over. Then just evaluating the meeting, end with, what did we do well? Was the time allocation realistic? And it's not realistic if you had 6 things on there and you only got to 2 of them. What can we do differently for the next meeting? So just evaluate the effectiveness of your meetings. Meetings are very important in a boarding context, and you can make your meetings very effective just with, doing these simple things. So just lastly, how do we assess our own communication effectiveness? How do we know whether we're communicating well? The first of these, I guess, would be to ask for feedback from your peers, ask for a formal review, work on a checklist, and there's a checklist in your notes. You might, and there is you'll see in the assessment 6.2 that there is a little evaluation form in there where you're asking peers for feedback. And we hope that is a useful exercise and not just something that's done purely for assessment. Look at the number and the frequency of communication problems that are occurring. And if you're having lots and lots of communication problems, people coming up to you and saying, well, look, I just didn't understand what you meant. You've got to consider that your communication is not effective, and you will need to change it. Get help with it, and just self-review. Just be very honest with yourself and review your own communication. So that's it. Thank you very much.